A bishop sits at his writing table in the autumn of 1382, reviewing a document his lawyers have spent months drafting. It is a foundation charter, pages of Latin clauses establishing a school at Winchester, listing the manors, rectories, and urban properties that will pay for it forever. He is not a young man. He has spent 3 decades in royal service, and none of that money is what people will remember him for. What they will remember is what happens to it after he signs. Now picture the other end of the same institution. A boy of 10 stands in a cold stone room before dawn, holding a wooden board with a sheet of parchment pinned to it. He has paid to be there. His father has paid the master an entrance fee, pays again every quarter, pays for candles in winter, pays for the parchment, and once a year hands over a coin for a school feast the master keeps for himself. The boy has been told that if he speaks a word of English instead of Latin during lessons, he will be beaten for it. The rules technically limit how many strokes the master may give in a single session, which tells you how far some masters had been allowed to get before somebody bothered to write that limit down. So did owning a medieval school make anyone rich? The bishop signing the charter, the master collecting quarter pennies, or neither of them? The first misunderstanding is picturing a school as a building. For most of the Middle Ages, a school was a man with a license and a room he did not own. The license was the asset. In a cathedral city, the right to teach grammar belonged to the church, granted out by an official usually called the scholasticus or the chancellor, and he granted it to one man at a time. That monopoly was the whole business. It meant every boy in the town who wanted Latin had exactly one place to buy it, and it meant the license holder spent a great deal of his energy chasing down anyone teaching without permission. Those disputes are not rare footnotes. They are some of the best documented things about medieval schooling, because unlicensed teachers were dragged into church courts constantly, and the records survive. A man teaching 4 boys in his kitchen was not a colleague. He was a poacher on somebody's franchise. There were 2 working answers to who owned the license, and they produced 2 completely different businesses. The first was the church school proper. Cathedral schools, song schools attached to a choir, schools kept by monasteries and hospitals and friaries. Here the master was an employee. He was paid a stipend out of church revenue, given lodging, sometimes given a share of fees on top, and he answered to the chancellor above him, steady, modest, and not his own. The second was the freelance grammar master. He held the license, rented the room, recruited his own boys, set his own charges within whatever ceiling custom allowed, and kept what was left. Higher upside, no floor underneath it at all. Before either kind of master could collect anything, though, a family had to decide the thing was worth buying, and the price came in more pieces than anyone expected. The advertised charge was small. Quarter payments were often reckoned in pennies, deliberately kept low enough that a merchant or a prosperous farmer could manage it. That figure is what gets quoted, and it is misleading, because it was never the whole bill. Entrance money was separate. A boy paid something on arrival simply to be admitted to the room. Candles were separate, and in a northern winter with lessons beginning before sunrise, candles were not a trivial line. Writing materials were separate, and parchment was expensive enough that most elementary work was done on wax tablets that could be smoothed flat and used again, or on a horn book, a single sheet of the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer pinned to a board under a layer of translucent horn to keep small hands from wearing it out. Books were separate again, and a boy's own copy of the standard grammar was a real purchase, not a school supply. Then came the customary payments, which were not fees exactly and could not be refused either. Cockpenny was the usual name in the north of England, a coin handed to the master at Shrovetide, sometimes tied to a cockfight the boys staged, sometimes just collected. Potation money paid for a drinking at the end of term. In some towns, the boys elected a boy bishop in December, dressed him in miniature vestments, paraded him through the streets, and the whole performance ran on contributions from families who could not decline without looking mean in front of the entire parish. And underneath all of it sat the largest cost, which never appears in any school's accounts at all. The boy was not working. A 10-year-old at a plow or in a workshop was worth something to his household every single day, and a family sending him to learn Latin was paying that loss quietly for years. If the family lived too far to walk, They were paying board on top, lodging their son with a townsman for the term. Which is why the surviving picture of who actually attended is narrower than the low fees suggest. Sons of merchants, of lesser gentry, of substantial tenants. Poor boys did get in through charity places, through a chorister's position that traded singing for schooling, through a patron who liked the look of them. But the fee was never the barrier, the years were. It is worth standing inside one of those years for a moment, because the schedule explains the candles. Lessons began before dawn and ran until the light went. A boy walked to the schoolroom in the dark, carrying his own light, sat on a bench with no back to it, and worked in a room heated by nothing but the number of bodies in it. There were 2 long sessions, morning and afternoon, broken by a meal he went home or back to his lodging to eat. He worked 6 days a week. Sunday was church, not rest, and on saints' days the school closed, which is why the calendar of a medieval schoolboy has holes in it in shapes no modern timetable would recognize. Almost everything was done aloud. Boys chanted grammar rules in unison because chanting is how you get a rule into a head that has no book to check. The senior boys heard the junior boys recite, which saved the master a salary and gave the seniors a first taste of the trade some of them would end up in. A wax tablet was scraped smooth and written on again the same hour. Parchment came out only when the work was worth keeping. And the boy was speaking Latin the entire time, not studying it, speaking it, to the master, to the other boys, at meals in the larger foundations, under the threat of the birch if he slipped into English. That is why the schools produced men who could draft a charter or argue a case in a room full of strangers from 4 countries. Latin was not a subject on the timetable, it was the air in the room. Almost nobody in that room was a girl. Girls of wealthy families learned to read, at home, from a chaplain or a mother or in a nunnery, and some of them read a great deal. But the grammar school existed to feed the church, the law, and the royal administration, and those doors were shut to them, so the pipeline never opened at the other end. The school was a training ground for offices women were not allowed to hold. That was the buyer's side. The seller's side turned out to be a far less dependable business than a monopoly license might suggest. A grammar master's income had one variable in it: how many boys were in the room this term. Everything else was fixed against him. He paid rent on the schoolroom whether it was full or empty. He paid for his own license. If he took an usher, an assistant to drill the younger boys through their declensions while he worked with the seniors, he paid the usher out of the same purse, and his customers could leave for reasons that had nothing to do with him. A bad harvest meant families needed hands at home. Plague emptied a town. A boy's father died and the boy went to work. A rival opened 3 streets away with a friendlier bishop behind him. There was no term in which last term's success carried forward. A master's asset was his reputation, and reputation had to be rebuilt from nothing every autumn. The teaching itself was standardized to a degree that would surprise anyone expecting medieval eccentricity. Boys began with the alphabet and the basic prayers, moved to Donatus, the late Roman grammar so universal that in French an elementary book was simply called a donat, and then to the Doctrinale of Alexandre de Villadé, a grammar written in verse specifically so that a boy could memorize it by chanting. After grammar came reading, then composition, then disputation, arguing set questions in Latin against another boy while the master corrected the mistakes. Discipline was part of the method rather than a failure of it. The birch appears so often in school imagery that it became the emblem of the profession itself. Some foundations wrote limits into their statutes. Some masters advertised gentleness as a selling point, which tells you what the alternative looked like. None of this made anybody wealthy. A grammar master in a good town in a good decade earned a respectable living, comparable to a skilled craftsman, better than a laborer, well below a merchant. He ended his career with what he had saved and nothing else. There was no equity in the business, nothing to sell, nothing to mortgage, nothing to leave a son, except the trade itself, and even that only if the license holder of the day would have him. Which raises the obvious question: if there was no fortune in it, why did anyone take the job? Because for a certain kind of man, it was not the destination. It was the only rung available. A clever boy from a modest household went to grammar school, did well, and got himself to a university. There he took an arts degree, which was in large part a degree in exactly the material he had just spent years being beaten through. And then he needed to eat. Teaching grammar was the standard way an arts graduate paid for himself while he waited for something better. And the something better was almost always a church living. A parish, a chaplaincy, a clerkship in a great household, a place in a bishop's administration, writing the letters that ran a diocese. So the schoolroom filled up with men who were passing through it. Some stayed 2 years, some stayed 40, and never got the letter that would have moved them on. The ones who moved on are the reason the system worked at all, because every one of them was living proof to the boys on the benches that the door out of a market town existed, and that the key to it was Latin. There were also masters who never had a fixed room. A man with a license and no town would go where the boys were, teach a season in one place, take a post in a household, teach the sons of a manor for as long as the sons lasted, and move again. The teaching trade at that level looked less like a profession and more like the life of a mason or a minstrel. You went to the work. And the masters knew perfectly well what they were selling. Look at what survives from their classrooms, and you find drilling sentences about buying cloth, hiring a servant, writing to a debtor, greeting a lord. The syllabus was pointed straight at the jobs. A father paying a quarter penny was not buying his son culture. He was buying him the vocabulary of somebody who would never have to lift anything. Which brings us back to the bishop, who never once stood in front of a room of boys. He has a name, William of Wykeham, and by the time he sat down to sign that charter, he had spent 30 years demonstrating that none of what follows required him to teach anything. He was born around 1324 in Hampshire to a family with no title and no significant land. His first employment was as a clerk. His early reputation was built not in a schoolroom, but on a building site, supervising the works at Windsor Castle for Edward III. And that competence at managing large, expensive projects carried him straight into royal administration. Keeper of the Privy Seal, Bishop of Winchester. Twice across his career, Chancellor of England. Along the way, he collected the standard reward for that kind of service in the 14th century. Church income, rectories, prebends, the keeperships of castles and manors. A portfolio of revenue every bit as precarious as anything a grammar master relied on, because each stream was tied to an office or to a king's continuing favor, and all of it would have gone to somebody else the day Wykeham died. His innovation was not accumulating that income. Plenty of royal servants managed that. It was refusing to let the income die with him. He founded his Oxford College first, in 1379. Then he built the other half of the machine, Winchester College, chartered in 1382 for 70 scholars, with a schoolroom, a chapel, a hall, dormitories, a warden, a headmaster, an usher, and an endowment of land large enough to feed and house all of it in perpetuity. And crucially, the school fed directly into the college. Boys who did well at Winchester went on to New College, Oxford, as of right. A school and a university foundation designed as one system, funded as one system, built to keep running long after the man who designed it was in the ground. That is the moment the economics of schooling change. Before it, a school was a man, and it ended when he did. After it, a school was a landowner. The difference shows up in what these foundations did with their money afterwards. Winchester College put capital into property that had nothing to do with education at all, including a large roadside inn at Andover, generating rent from travelers who would never conjugate a verb, let out to a tenant who carried the daily risk while the college simply collected. That is the endowed school working exactly as designed, an institution that had outlived its founder, still buying income-producing property decades later, still converting a bishop's long-dead royal career into bread and candles for boys who never met him. The model was copied almost immediately, because it was a formula any sufficiently well-placed churchman could follow. Henry VI built Eton on the same twin institution template around 1440, feeding boys directly into King's College, Cambridge. Merchant guilds and city companies copied it too, endowing town grammar schools out of trade money instead of church money. And below the grand foundations sat the cheapest version of the same idea, the chantry school. A wealthy man left land to pay a priest to sing masses for his soul forever, and added a clause that the priest should also teach the local boys, usually free since he had the time between services. It cost the founder nothing extra. It gave England hundreds of small schools funded by the machinery of prayer. Running an endowment, though, was its own trade, and nothing about it resembled teaching. An endowed school did not receive money. It received manors, rectories, tithes, and rents scattered across counties, each with a tenant, a boundary, a customary due, and a way of going wrong. Somebody had to write out to collect. Somebody had to sue when the collecting failed. Somebody had to sit twice a year over rolls of parchment, adding up what had actually come in against what should have. That is why these foundations were built with a warden or a provost at the top, who was an administrator, and a headmaster underneath him, who was merely the man who taught. The teacher was never in charge of the money. He was a salaried line inside it. And the accounts show where the money really went, not on salaries mostly, on food. Feeding 70 scholars every day of the year meant buying bread, ale, fish, and meat at whatever the market was doing that season. And a bad year for grain was a bad year for the school, even when every tenant paid in full. On building, because stone that houses boys needs a roof kept on it forever. On lawsuits, because a landowner who never dies is a landowner who is always in court about something. That is the trade the founder actually made. He swapped a simple risk for a complicated one. The freelance master risked an empty room. The endowed school risked bad harvests, dishonest bailiffs, disputed boundaries, and its own repair bills, permanently, in exchange for never having to worry about whether anybody felt like enrolling this year. What made all of this different from the freelance master was durability, not size. A master's fees stop the day he stopped teaching. Land does not need to be popular or competent or even alive to keep collecting rent, which raises the uncomfortable question for an institution built specifically to survive its founder. What was actually strong enough to threaten it? The ordinary threats hit the fee-based school hardest. Plague emptied benches and killed masters. Bad harvests pulled boys back to the fields. Jurisdictional fights between a licensed master and an interloper could run through the church courts for years and cost more than the disputed pupils were worth. The endowed school shrugged most of that off because its risk was spread. A fire at one property, a defaulting tenant on one manor, a disputed field a day's ride away, each was a real loss. None of them on its own could stop the school feeding its scholars. That is a genuinely different position from a master watching his room empty. It is not the same as having escaped the underlying economy. And in England, the endowed model met the one threat it had no answer to at all. Not plague, not riot, not competition. Legislation. The chantries were dissolved in the 1540s, and the endowments that had quietly funded hundreds of small schools were seized along with the prayers they were attached to. Some were refounded, many were not. Land is durable against weather, tenants, and time. It is not durable against a crown that decides to take it. And when that happened, the difference between the two kinds of school showed up one last time, backwards. A grammar master who lost his room lost a living. He could pick up another license in another town and start again, because everything he owned was in his head. A dissolved chantry school lost the land, and there was nothing in anyone's head that could replace a manor. The schools that survived the 1540s survived because somebody, a town corporation, a guild, a petitioning group of parents, went and asked for the endowment back and got it, often refounded under a new name and a royal charter. The schools that vanished completely, and in a good many English towns, the only trace left is a line in a will about a priest who was supposed to teach the boys forever. The master, collecting his quarter pennies, was running a business with no equity, no inheritance, and no protection beyond his own continued ability to fill a room. It could make a capable man comfortable for exactly as long as he kept teaching, and not one day longer. The bishop signing his charter was doing something categorically different. Converting 3 decades of royal offices, none of which would have survived him by a week, into an institution that has now outlasted him by more than 6 centuries. Still standing in Winchester, still teaching boys who have never heard his name. Both men, in their own way, got exactly what a medieval school had to offer. Only one of them was ever going to be remembered by what he left standing.